In February 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte defied the expectations of Europe, departing from exile in Elba and engaging in what some might generously call his final adventure. It was to prove to be a fateful and futile effort, ending with defeat at Waterloo and ultimately resulting in Napoleon's second abdication. The episode of the 1815 campaign and Napoleon's 100 Days achieved nothing, but has raised many questions. Some of those questions that arise from Napoleon's last great adventure were put to myself, Professor Kate Astbury, and Dr. Michael Rowe in a In Our Time episode for the BBC a few weeks ago. But in the course of our preparations, the three of us found that we had much more to say than could actually be squeezed into a standard BBC broadcast. So, what better way to commemorate the anniversary of Waterloo than to discuss the time that led up to the Waterloo campaign? Tonight, Professor Kate Astbury and Dr. Michael Rowe join me to delve into the reality of Napoleon's return. Had the leopard truly changed his spots? Could we have seen a more successful Bonapartist regime? Or ultimately, was Waterloo, or something like Waterloo, always going to happen? This is Napoleon's Final Days, the Emperor's final fatal folly. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where what you won't have realized is that I have fumbled that opening introduction about 15,000 times in front of my guest, and it has been hugely embarrassing. But you've probably picked up the gist that we are covering some unfinished business in this episode. When we recorded with the BBC, we prepped a whole load of stuff about the time leading up to Waterloo, but perhaps inevitably ended up spending more time talking about Waterloo than the 100 Days itself. So we figured, why don't we redress that and sit down and continue the conversation, which the BBC very generously didn't object to when I asked them. So the plan for this one is for me to shut up and take a back seat because I have two fantastic newcomers to the podcast with me this evening. Professor Kate Astbury is Professor of French Studies at the University of Warwick. Her research focuses on the ways in which cultural forms inflect the public sphere and shape political legitimacy in France from 1750 through to 1815. Since 2013, she's been working with Porchester Castle in Hampshire on the stories of French prisoners of war held there during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which frankly might end up being an episode in its own right further down the line. Hold that thought. We are also joined by Dr. Michael Rowe, who's a reader in European history at King's College London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's published on various aspects of the Napoleonic Empire, including especially its impact on Germany. Again, we need to have a conversation about episodes. He's currently working on a general history of Napoleon's world. Please let me know when that's published, because there'll be an episode on that as well, because it needs to be done. Great to see you again in a sort of slightly less high pressure environment. I don't know about you, but I was shaking for much of the first 10 minutes of that BBC broadcast. How are you both feeling? How did you enjoy the episode as well when it aired?
Yeah, I liked it. I thought it was a great episode. I know that that you can never quite tell when you're in an episode, you think it's going to be dreadful because you're not sure whether you're making sense and you're not quite sure how it's all going to be edited to put together. I thought they actually produced a really great episode out of our random musings in the studio.
Yeah, agreed. I think it was pretty accessible. I hope it was. I think we could have said more about the politics, mind you, of 100 Days and had a slightly less Waterloo focus. So I guess this is what this episode is about.
Absolutely. I mean, Waterloo and waxing lyrical about all of that is fine for me. That's sort of one of my wheelhouses. But I was surprised slightly that we didn't kind of do more on the politics and all the rest of it. So hey, let's dive into this and redress that balance. And we'll start with the first exile, which isn't really the beginning. It's sort of the the end of the middle or the beginning of the end. I'm not quite sure where it fits in the whole story, but it's not really the beginning. But we'll start there anyway. The terms of the exile, what did they look like? And let's kind of have a think about the unease, I guess, that was perhaps felt over the fact that if you stick Napoleon on Elba, he's awfully close to Italy. And why that was a problem for some people. It feels to me as though this was a solution that basically only kept Tsar Alexander happy. Kate, do you want to start us off?
I'll start us off, yes. Terms of the exile and the location, lots of things we could be thinking about. The Treaty of Fontainebleau talks of Elba as Napoleon's preferred place of residence. I think that's another piece of spin by Napoleon, quite cleverly written in to make it sound as though he's the one that's choosing to go into exile rather than having it imposed upon him. It's very much the case that Alexander offered it without consulting the other allies, but they all felt that they couldn't really go back on that idea once it had been presented. It can be defended reasonably easily as an island. Napoleon, because he's given sovereignty over it, means that he has a small force at his disposal and therefore has quite a lot of autonomy on the island to be doing what he wants. But it is a good base to launch a campaign in Italy where he might gather troops for an invasion of France. Fouché, the Minister of Police during much of Napoleon's empire, talked about Napoleon in Italy as being like Vesuvius and Naples. The threat of an eruption is always there. I think that's quite a nice analogy to see just how uncomfortable Napoleon being so close to Italy makes people feel, particularly those who are at the Congress of Vienna.
Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I would step back a little bit, and I teach students Napoleon, and sometimes I get the question, why didn't they just sort of shoot it? And of course that's what you do in the 20th century. Well, of course Hitler commits suicide, but they would have probably shot him had he not committed suicide. And they basically execute people like Goering, who they get their hands on, and Saddam Hussein, etc. in 2003, was it? And I suppose a glib answer is, well, they just didn't do that in the early 19th century. At one level, it's a more civilized age. I mean, the whole narrative that the Allies are coming up with is that they are fighting arbitrary sort of illegality, as represented by Napoleon, and they're going to set up some kind of new moral legal order. And so you can't really start that new legal order with an act of illegality. And then, of course, the problem arises, what crime has Napoleon committed? You can't just sort of try him as a war criminal, because what is the crime he has committed? He's been recognized by pretty much all the other powers as a sovereign. He's married to a Habsburg. He signed a treaty of peace with Alexander at Tilsit, so on and so forth, and with Prussia as well. The British, I think they hold out actually in calling him, basically General Bonaparte. So I think the British are the only ones who could conceivably say that he's some kind of non-sovereign. But then, that even on the British side, it would beg the question, what British laws he kind of like broken? So you're stuck. I mean, the French could have perhaps conceivably said, this is Louis XVIII's France, that he's some kind of traitor. But there were more important traitors and regicides who they can go after than Napoleon. So you have to get Napoleon to sort of abdicate, sort of voluntarily. And that means you do have to offer him something. And then, the question is what? And I suppose you can only really offer him realistically French territory, something which you can dispose of. And Elba is, although today it's part of Italy and, it'd been previously not part of France before the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, it is technically part of France. And you probably want an island, and it probably has to be a small island, but not a lump of rock. So I guess by a kind of process of elimination, you're going to get something like Elba. I don't know why they didn't go for something like Guadeloupe or Mauritius, maybe. I think perhaps they do want something in European waters. So I guess by default you get Elba as a kind of compromise, but as as Kate has pointed out, in many ways it is kind of really problematic, especially its proximity to Italy, which of course is an area of the world really neglected in our BBC broadcast.
One thing that does strike me about the shoot him question as well is if you're going to execute Napoleon, sort of
Mm.
the echo of the French Revolution, the execution of the French monarchy, there's been a lot of sort of positioning and posturing around return to sort of ideals pre 1789. We often talk about Waterloo being sort of a triumph for the ancien regime system and a restoration of an older order. The genie probably can't be put quite back in the bottle in the way that it had been pre 1789. But it's always struck me that that's another big issue, that if you just start going around executing monarchs, particularly with Napoleon, where he's got this veneer. I've never bought the kind of the democratic sort of acclamation argument entirely, but he's got this veneer of legitimacy by having gone to the people with those plebiscites. It creates all kinds of additional follow-on problems because if you can do that to Napoleon, what's to say that if there's another situation where another nation is defeated by its enemies, you can't just create a ripple effect and it sets that dangerous precedent. Is that in the minds of the Allied powers come 1814?
We're not so very far past the execution of Louis XVI. Louis XVI is executed in January 1793. One of the things that does is reinforce the Allies' commitment to safeguarding each other's monarchies or empires. And so I think it would be very difficult for them to take a step back and behave as regicides. So I think because of the proximity to the execution of Louis XVI and this more general return to an honourable way of doing warfare, where you exchange prisoners and where people of rank are treated decently, I don't think it even really enters into serious consideration that they could behave like that, because that would make them on a par with the revolutionaries, which is something that they're systematically trying to set themselves against, for fear that the democratic contagion that the revolutionary decade had sort of set off might then spread back through the rest of Europe.
Yeah, I mean, who would have pulled the trigger? I mean, the Austrians aren't going to do it because you'd be killing your own son-in-law, wouldn't you? If you're Francis I. So that's not going to happen. The Russians are as this kind of like generous, magnanimous sort of mode, this sort of Christian ruler. So you can't do it. The British are very legalistic. They believe in things like habeas corpus, etc. So who's going to pull the trigger there? Maybe the Prussians, possibly. I mean, they certainly have the mood to do it, at least some of them. Although, Frederick William III is quite kind of cautious and sort of, pretty kind of follows due process and so on. So it's just really impossible. I mean, the only way he's going to get killed is probably by some kind of royalist lynch mob with a nod and a wink, from possibly not Louis XVIII, but his brother, the Comte d'Artois, if they managed to sort of get hold of Napoleon. And probably in retrospect, a lot of people might have wished that would have happened. Some kind of incident as Napoleon sort of passes through southern France. But he doesn't, and he ends up in Elba, and they have a problem.
They do indeed. Just before we move on to discuss the nature of that problem, one thing that does occur to me as you were saying this, who's going to pull the trigger, Mike, it did occur to me. Blucher is probably the most obvious senior figure who I can think of who seems to have this desire to stick Napoleon up against a wall and put a musket to his head. And it just makes me question, is Blucher actually out of touch, either with sort of the elite, if you will, within the political circles in Europe? Or is he actually reflecting perhaps a more popular mood within Prussia?
Yes, I think he is out of touch. I mean, after Waterloo, the Waterloo campaign, of course, which makes Blucher even more famous than he is in 1814. He talks about actually accepting that France should be a republic, shore it of some territory, punish France, but leave it to the French themselves. Well, not necessarily leave it to the French themselves, but accept the fact that probably a republic is the best system for France. It's the system the French people can live with. Now, of course, that's completely bonkers in terms of what his boss, Frederick William III, or indeed any of the other allies are going to accept. But as from a historian's perspective, looking back, you might actually say that there was a sort of element of wisdom there, and the French going into a republic in 1815 might, because that's where they end up in sort of, well, briefly in 1848 and then after 1870 would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. But yeah, I mean, Napoleon, yes, he probably, I think in Prussia's maybe a sort of exceptional case. Out of all of the allies, it has suffered more, with possibly Russia in second place because of 1812, which is horrendous. But, the Russian people don't really have much of a voice in this anyway. It's the Tsar. And of course, Britain is never occupied. And the Austrians are sort of, they're campaigned across, but they're not really occupied for any length of time. And hey, they've got that Habsburg marriage in 1810, so that kind of does make things a bit awkward, doesn't it?
Yeah, going and killing your sort of son-in-law is not the best of looks as relationships go. I mean, people talk about sort of nightmare in-laws. Actively campaigning for you to be shot is probably the worst of possible variations you can have from your in-laws. But let us move on. And I'm keen to talk about the reasons for his return within all of this. I'm not sure quite how we've got 20 minutes in and we're only on question 1A, but never mind. Because I always see excuses being bandied around, and you two are two of the experts on this. It makes sense to get your take on it. Sometimes people turn around and talk about Napoleon getting bored on Elba. I have been guilty of saying that because I do think there is this sense that initially he has some energy and then that energy dissipates. And he's looking, to my mind, for more of a challenge. This is the guy who's ruled the largest empire France has seen since Charlemagne. He needs to be active and occupied, and Elba is never going to cut it for him. You also see people turn around and say, well, he didn't get the money that he was promised in the form of his pension. It does seem like a little bit of an excessive thing to just sort of invade an entire country when you don't get your pension. The WASPy women were able to campaign for their pension dues without going to war. Obviously, I'm being flippant there, but both of these, you can see my point. Both of these feel like sort of slightly awkward, slightly bad excuses to legitimize what Napoleon does. So, what are your thoughts on why he chooses to come back? Mike, do you want to start us off? Yeah, Kate, go for it.
So I'm lots of thoughts. I think that Napoleon's sense of superiority doesn't diminish because he's forced to abdicate. He spent the best part of a decade convinced that he's the right person to be leading France and that he's got the answers to a whole series of problems. The fact that all of his administrative changes largely survived to this day suggests that he did indeed have a number of solutions to a lot of France's problems. That's a different conversation. But if we talk about his sense of superiority still there, and you add in other factors, so he knows that the army is unhappy because lots of them have been put on half pay and they're wandering around with nothing to do, having been largely extremely successful for the previous decade. Louis hasn't paid him as was agreed. His wife and son haven't joined him. The Congress of Vienna are discussing sending him away from Elba. As early as November 1814, they're talking about moving him potentially to St. Helena, which is where they will send him in the end. So by moving him, he would be less able to mount a campaign. And that's why they're having that conversation, because they're a little bit nervous of him being so close to Italy. So if you add a lot of small factors together, you start to get a reason why he might be thinking about returning to power. So I don't know that there's necessarily any one thing. The why he does it when he does it is this question of the Congress of Vienna threatening to move him somewhere where he would not be able to influence the world stage in the way that he can from Elba.
Mike?
Yes, I think I'd go with Kate there on that last point, the realization that his stay on Elba isn't going to necessarily be permanent. I think is probably going to weigh more heavily than the 1 million, grant, which isn't delivered. It is 1 million, isn't it? I think. I mean, the money itself is more symbolic at one level. Of course, if you run out of money, you run out of possible support and networks. But I think there is that sense that time is running out and that the deal that he'd signed up to, which he'd never really wanted, is being kind of broken by the Allied side, and that he is heading into that realm of sort of political irrelevance fast. I think that's very important. I'm not sure in my own mind how important those reports are coming from Vienna that the Allied powers are sort of falling apart. Of course, we have to remember that there's a sort of time lag, isn't there? And when it comes to the Congress of Vienna, the worst moment is really around New Year's Eve, New Year, 1814-15, very beginning of December, very end of December, early January, when it does seem that the coalition is going to split over Saxony and over Poland. And of course, this news is being fed to Napoleon, but with a time lag. So he kind of makes his decision, I think, in his own mind at the worst kind of moment from the perspective of Allied unity. Now, had there been instantaneous kind of news, and had he realized that things are being patched up on the Allied side and that they're going to be unified, would those other factors have nonetheless pushed him over the line or not? There, I'm not quite so sure. I think he would have probably moved anyway and just believed in his lucky star. And as Kate said, that he's kind of like, he's got some kind of quality which is almost, puts him above other human beings. I think he probably would have gone actually anyway, because if not in early 1815, then never. He's going to be shunted out to probably St. Helena anyway.
We also should talk about Murat within the context of all of this, right? Often forgotten in the context of the 1815 story. Somebody else who has concerns about whether or not his position is going to be tenable in the longer term. What does that position look like, I guess, in Naples? Is it fair to say that the clock is ticking for him, as is sometimes suggested, or does he actually have some options and then end up embracing the worst of those options?
To my mind, the story of Napoleon's 100 Days is a series of people who will do anything to keep control of power, to stay in power. It's a sort of recurring theme. We've got Napoleon, we've got Murat, we've got Fouché. You've got a whole series of individuals who will do more or less anything to keep hold of the power that they've got or get back the power that they've lost. So that's how I read Murat anyway. He'd chosen in 1814 to do a deal with the Austrians so that he could retain a position of power. That's quite he's set out his stall, as it were. He's done a deal in order to keep himself in power. Having realised that they've not really got much intention of keeping their side of the bargain, he can use Napoleon's return from Elba as an opportunity to call for Italian independence and sort of galvanise support from across Italy more generally. It's a bit of a sideline to the story of Napoleon and the 100 Days, but obviously it has huge implications for Italy because his defeat at Tolentino will be seen by Italian nationalists as a spur to taking matters into their own hands, and then completely sends Italy down a course towards unification perhaps more rapidly than it would have managed to get there otherwise. But I'm not an Italian history specialist. So I'm not going to start speculating on the alternative stories of Italian independence. But Murat's actions do have a very direct impact on the way in which the Italian states are going to, and Italian nationalists are going to interpret that space, which will have consequences for the rest of the 19th century.
Mike?
Yeah. I mean, the three powers which really count in Italy, I guess, are obviously not Prussia and are not Russia, who vaguely don't really care all that much. It's the British, and the British, of course, this is their Mediterranean moment. You know, they've seized Malta, but they've also sort of quasi-occupied Sicily throughout most of the Napoleonic Wars. And they really hate this kind of Murat deal, and Murat being in Naples, and they want a restoration, and they've got kind of naval capacity to be important. Um, the Austrians, of course, see Italy as their sort of zone of interest, and although they do this deal, by February, so even before Napoleon's escape, Metternich is making it pretty clear that they want Murat out, and of course, for restoration, Bourbons want Murat out. And Murat knows this. And I think those three, I mean, I don't know exactly how they would have engineered it, sort of counterfactually. But I think Murat's days are numbered, okay? For British, the French, and the Austrians are against you, and you are an Italian kingdom. You've got real problems. And of course, the exiled, well, the legitimate, if you like, monarchs of Naples and Sicily are sort of dual Bourbon Habsburg in effect. Yeah, I think again, as with Napoleon, for Murat, it's kind of a now or never sort of moment, and he doesn't want to. He doesn't want to be something less than it was like a sovereign, basically.
Yeah, Murat does get a difficult hand, I think, on this. I'm known on this podcast for being no fan of Murat whatsoever. The guy looks incredible in his portraits, knew how to style a uniform, but regular listeners will know my views on Murat. We won't go back down that rabbit hole, but I do feel ever so slightly sorry for him when it comes to just the way in which it all falls apart. This is sort of the whimper that he wouldn't have wanted that ends his life for me. But anyway, we'll stick with Napoleon's story because that is the focus of today. But we're going to fast forward to the point where he's actually in Paris. If folks want the chronological breakdown, then they can go and listen to the In Our Time episode. I'll do a link in the episode description. It feels to me that almost immediately, as soon as Napoleon's back in Paris, his PR machine is back as if nothing had ever happened. The newspapers are proclaiming things like Emperor Napoleon is infantile, the scenes of joy cannot be described. And I'm curious about this because I've always wondered quite where the lead comes with it. Why is Napoleon so good at this? He seems to have had this sort of innate ability almost from the start of his career. It's certainly visible when he's commanding in Italy. Why is he able to get inside people's heads so effectively?
It's very easy to put this down to charisma, but I don't know if we should take the easy option at this point and say it's just down to charisma. But having said that, Napoleon believes that he's superior. He conveys that to others, but I wonder if it's not that he's saying things that people want to believe. I wouldn't want to make political analogies to buses with messages on, but there is a sense that some people want to believe the sorts of things that the Napoleonic PR machine is coming out with. And it's very easy to persuade people to believe things that they want to believe. The press have a vested interest in appearing to be on his side once it's clear that Louis is leaving town. Napoleon has closed newspapers before and can do so again. And so the fact that newspapers are reporting the people's joy at Napoleon's return can't necessarily be taken as an entirely neutral commentary. If they're going to remain open, they have to be towing the party line to a certain extent because he's already got a very clear track record on closing newspapers down. Having said all of that, making it from the south coast of France to Paris without a drop of blood being spilled is always going to be the stuff that legend is made of and is going to capture the imagination. John Hobhouse, who was in Paris at the time, commented that Napoleon had rallied French pride and therefore becomes a figurehead for those who were longing for a return to the revolution. So that sort of latent anti-clericalism, latent anti-monarchical sentiment that we'd seen during the revolutionary decade. So he becomes a figurehead and perhaps slightly ironically a symbol for the left. Huge ironies in him becoming a symbol for the revolutionaries, but that's a different matter. So I wonder if it's a combination of things. It's that he represents something that people want to believe, that he can make France great again. I feel as I'm slipping back into Brexit analogies, but he wants to make France great again. People want France to be great again, and they feel that perhaps the message that he's offering will take them in that direction. They want to believe that, because Louis XVIII isn't the most inspiring of figures, and had not necessarily won over the hearts and minds in 1814.
I mean, what you're alluding to there is a whole other area of debate. Maybe we'll get into it, maybe we won't, about sort of populism and to what extent does Napoleon tap into that. I think there's a pretty strong argument that can be made there. And then, of course, you get into sort of is Napoleon sort of Trump in a different era, to which I emphatically say no, because Napoleon emphatically demonstrated competence, if nothing else. But that says far more about my political leanings than anything else. So we'll move rapidly on. Mike, let me get your take on all of this and Napoleon, the PR machine, and his abilities.
Yeah, well, of course, he's built up his image over since the mid 1790s. So he already has charisma. He doesn't really need to sort of demonstrate it from afresh in early 1815. And Zach, I see behind you that sort of like little statuette of Napoleon.
Indeed. It's surprising, actually, if you know my... Sorry, carry on.
I mean, it's tiny on my screen, but it's just, the hat, it's that sort of outline, that silhouette of Napoleon is just unmistakable. And I suppose part of me would say, yeah, the press is kind of concentrated in Paris. And Paris is going to be more pro-Napoleon than parts of the south of France. So that's an advantage. Napoleon sells. So, I mean, what do you expect the Parisian press to do in sort of February, March, as Napoleon's getting clearer? Even if they hated him, they're probably going to kind of report his progress, albeit in maybe slightly different terms. But if you're a commercial organization and, the press is ultimately, much of it is, has to sell, you are going to write about Napoleon's progress. And it's probably going to become increasingly positive, the more likely he is going to make it, because you are going to be thinking of living under a Napoleonic regime again in the future. So Napoleon sells. There's that weird relationship between him and not only the press but artists generally. In that he really kind of micromanages his artists and gives them hell in a way, and sort of tries to say exactly how they're going to paint him. And he doesn't really give them much agency at one level, but on the other hand, he is incredibly profitable for them. So if you're an artist or a newspaper publisher, how do you respond to that dynamic? And the answer is most people are pragmatic, and they say, okay, I'm going to swallow my pride and I'm going to report about Napoleon and build him up. That's what
we see that in the British context as well. The caricaturists of London are delighted that Napoleon is back, not necessarily because they share his political standpoint, but because he's such a great figure to put into political cartoons. He's a much more exciting figure than Louis XVIII. They can do so much more with their caricatures with Napoleon back that it becomes a field day for British caricaturists, that they can't resist the lure of Napoleon either.
Yeah, Napoleon as a commercial entity. There's a PhD thesis in that somewhere, isn't there? And a very well received one, I'm sure. I mean, we were talking about, you mentioned this actually in the BBC episode, didn't you, Mike? Look at the Waterloo gift shop, where you will find that statue on the shelf behind me. Can you find a statue of Wellington or Blucher? Can you find anything of Wellington or Blucher in that shop? No, you can't. Partly because it's owned by the French, which is what a lot of people don't realize. So all of the supply, there's kind of a very interesting thing going on there. So yes, this is a really good point. In terms of the apparatus, is he just able to, because obviously we know Napoleon press censorship, it's part of what he does. Is he able to just immediately pick that up? Or to what extent has the leopard changed its spots when it comes to the 100 days? I'm always pretty uncompromising on this point and say, absolutely not. He's just aware that he can't be the same guy from 1813 and 1814. When it comes to the newspapers, do you see a meaningful freedom of speech? To me, actually, it's just a different way of facilitating it because Fouché just has men placed in all of the offices of these newspapers. So, although there might not be a sort of centralized vetting process going on, it just means that all of the vetting has been sort of pushed out and is done in house. What's your take? Mike, do you want to start us off on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think the press reaction goes beyond Fouché media management. I think there is genuine enthusiasm there. I think it would have happened without the apparatus. Fouché, of course, keeps his finger on the pulse of French opinion. And that becomes quite important later on, I think, when it comes to the sort of second abdication and when he knows, the parameters of what is possible and impossible. So, yeah, I mean, Fouché is formidable, but I think the press at this moment is actually relatively free. We're back to that sort of some of them, the early 1790s. This is actually a good time to be a newspaper journalist. Mind you do need to be careful. It's not quite clear whether Louis XVIII might be back. And I think most wise French people, and we'll probably talk about this when it comes to the elections, are very cautious about committing themselves. I think you try not to burn bridges for as long as possible.
With Fouché being the perfect example of that, of course. Fouché, Minister of Police, voted for the death of Louis XVI under the Revolution, one of the ultimate sort of girouette, changing allegiances and positioning himself so that he's always there within a chance and hedging his bets. He will go back to having a post under Louis XVIII, despite having been made Minister of Police by Napoleon in 1815. So, yeah, ultimate successful hedging of bets there. I think that because Napoleon, on landing on the south coast, tries to appeal to the revolutionary principles of equality and liberty and freedom, his hand is slightly twisted behind his back in some of that. And therefore, though he doesn't want to be changing his spots, the way in which he's tried to make sure that everybody supports him does limit a little bit the room for maneuver he has once he gets back to Paris.
I mean, positioning yourself on the left, I mean, ultimately the default position is you can't position yourself on the right as such, because that space is occupied by the Bourbons and legitimacy and so on. But if you go too far left, of course, you then alienate the middle. You alienate property owners who, yes, they may be worried that a really hard restoration will question their property rights, but it hasn't up until that point. But you don't want some kind of revolutionary redistribution of wealth, anti-property kind of regime coming in if you are a notable in. Now, of course, Napoleon isn't going to do that ultimately because he himself believes in sort of landed property in particular. But he's got a bit of a balancing act, I think. How far left, how revolutionary is he? I think he can do the French nationalist thing easily enough, and sort of say the Bourbons are a sort of like foreign imposition. Once he's declared to be an outlaw, of course, because before that he tries to sort of pretend that he's part of a sort of European sort of family of monarchies again. But once that's rejected, I think he can possibly go back to the 1793 mode in terms of defending the patrie. But can you go back to 1793 at that level without then also going back to the Jacobin terror domestically? And then you're going to
certainly a lot of his opponents thought not. There's a
yeah.
lot of discussion then about both in writing and in caricatures across Europe that he is no better than a Jacobin.
Mm. Yeah, and that's completely wrong, of course, because he's nothing of a sort, you know. Certainly not in 1814 and 1815.
We'll stay with this this question about how extensive Napoleon's support is, because we've sort of moved in that direction already. And you've got a huge area of debate here, from the suggestion that this was fundamentally a military coup that simply saw the French acquiesce in their despair at knowing quite what the hell to make of it all, through to something that's perhaps a bit more of an Andrew Roberts style suggestion of, you know, there being this mass grassroots movement in support of Napoleon. Um, Obviously, elections are a factor within this as one way of trying to measure and scrutinize all of it. And we have quite a bit to go on, it has to be said, for 1815. Before we look at those results, though, just talk us through the challenges of using election data as a source and how you can potentially deal with that as a problem in terms of trying to unpick it.
There's great potential for big data, I think, actually, that there are a lot of tiny results from the various democratic processes, whether it's the plebiscite, whether it's the municipal elections. Tiny studies have been done on parts of France, but no one has done a study that actually gathers the data for every area of France and then compare different types of elections for the same areas against each other. I don't have the digital computer skills and the big data background to be able to do that, but it's now that the big data world can do that sort of thing. I think it would be really interesting to take the results of the different elections and the plebiscite and map them against each other, and perhaps other sources as well. The numbers reporting for duty of the National Guard would be another set of figures you could potentially feed into this. Napoleon isn't reinstating conscription, but using the National Guard as a way of calling up people to fight gives you some data about who's showing up and who isn't. In Besançon, in the east of France, only one resident rejects the plebiscite, but half of those due to be called up to the National Guard don't show up. So it'd be really interesting to take lots of different bits of data and put them and map them all together across so that you could really get a sense of, is it the rural areas that are supporting Napoleon in 1815? Is there really a dip in urban support? Is that urban support still there in Paris, but not in some of the other cities? It's crying out for big data. Don't think we're there yet because nobody's done the archival work in the first place to get all the individual results, but it would be fantastic to be able to map them all in that sort of way across each other.
Well, there we go. That's the second PhD thesis that we've commissioned in the space of one episode. Mike, let me get your reaction to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to do several things. And I think the comparative approach is important. And by that, I mean sort of comparing election results in 1815 with, you know, the plebiscites earlier on in 1800 and 02 and 04, and looking at things like sort of voter turnout. I mean, personally, if I were Napoleon, I wouldn't be as depressed as I think Napoleon actually was about the results. I don't think he was best pleased. They don't publish them anyway. But I think I'm more with Andrew Roberts. I think given the circumstances, they do show, you know, a healthy modicum of support. I take Kate's point, of course, voting for somebody doesn't mean that you're going to die for them. And of course, joining the National Guard possibly means that. But, you know, what would voter turnout be in Britain if, you know, it's all dying for the regime as opposed to simply vaguely expressing an interest in it? I think people also need to be reminded, of course, that voting is in public. Voting is probably the equivalent of losing a day's labor. You know, you need to kind of make your way to the sort of where voting takes place, and for people that means a journey. So in British terms, it might be a 3 or 4 hour journey. So by rail travel, that's as if you were living in London and your polling booth was in, I don't know, Manchester, or and coming back again. So I mean, voting is more tricky in this period. I think what is really interesting to do is kind of compare the election results of 1815 against each other. And of course, you've got different franchises. At least when it comes to the local elections, you've got a much broader franchise in effect when it comes to the national one. And then you can kind of start to say, oh, well, probably Napoleon had more working class support than he has support from the notables, who I think are more cautious in 1815. So I think that for me is a key take from those elections.
Okay, well, let's dive straight into that rabbit hole then and start breaking this up. The obvious starting point, I guess, is the plebiscite, the one that everybody talks about. What does it tell us? Factoring in sort of the challenges, of course, like not counting results in areas that are in revolt against Napoleon. What can we read into these results?
To start with, I think we need to think about the use of the plebiscite at all. It had been quite successful early on in the empire as a way of giving him popular legitimacy, and he is back very much on a ticket of popular legitimacy. I'm the chosen one. People of France want me. If they didn't want me, they wouldn't have let me arrive back in power. They'd have resisted and remained loyal to Louis XVIII. So he's using the plebiscite as a way of trying to ratify some of the compromises he's had to make in order, with people like Benjamin Constant, to support his return to power and the practicalities of government. But having recourse to a plebiscite as a quick way of gaining support for the additional act is problematic. People are not quite so prepared to just blithely accept what's put in front of them. There's a lot less fiddling, I think, of results. I think that there's quite general consensus that figures are inflated earlier in the empire, and perhaps we don't get the same massaging of the figures in 1815 that we do. But I very much agree with Mike that the results are quite solid. They're not spectacular, but they're solid. Not at all bad, I think, was one of the conclusions that Malcolm Crook, who's done most of the work on elections in 1815, sort of concludes, that this is a solid, if not spectacular, return. But I don't think the machinery has got back up and running yet to be able to do the significant inflation of figures that we perhaps saw earlier on in the empire.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. You know, kind of acceptable level. The turnout, I think, is about half, or maybe a little bit more than half, but close to half that sort of high point, which is the life consulate. You know, that's the really impressive one. You know, we say Napoleon isn't maybe that impressed, but of course, I think Napoleon and his associated ideology, which comes into being, Bonapartism, tries to see itself as above party, and I think is aiming for something more than 50%. It's not interested in 50%. It's interested in, if not unanimity, something a very big figure. And that, of course, that's why Napoleon cheats and his regime cheats in those earlier plebiscites. It's not that he's going to kind of lose as such, but so I think what we as historians need to look at is those who pluck up the courage to I guess, abstain or vote no. And the abstention figures are pretty high. So there's a very large part of France which is biding its time. It doesn't mean that they're opposed to Napoleon. It's just that they're waiting to see who's going to win, frankly. So success breeds success, I think, and Napoleon needs to win some victories fast. And as soon as he kind of hits a defeat, I think that support, you know, the bulk of France is going to go against him.
As you were saying about, you know, that sense that the Bonapartist regime isn't necessarily interested in sort of 50%. I just had this sort of little voice in the back of my mind going, I won by a lot. which heads back to a conversation that we sort of vaguely had earlier, doesn't it? Okay, next up, national elections. Do these paint a different picture? Talk us through the distinction here between the plebiscite and the national elections. What's actually at stake? You talked about a difference in franchise. Talk me through all of these things. Kate?
So once we're on to national elections, so elections for the Chamber of Representatives is done by electoral college, whereas Napoleon made a big play about the plebiscite being about universal male suffrage. So you've got a much more restricted group of individuals who are entitled to vote. The whole way in which that electoral college was set up is designed to keep the people, in inverted commas, away from voting because they can't really be trusted. That's that sort of still that we're still in the early days of the revolution had shown that you don't really give the people the chance to vote because they don't really know how to vote sensibly. So you've got an electoral college that is primarily made up of a social elite who are more likely to be of the right, if not openly royalist. So you are looking at a much smaller group of individuals able to vote and much less likely to be wildly enthusiastic about a return to power by Napoleon.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, these electoral colleges, you're talking about the so-called notables. So forgive me if I'm wrong. I think they were defined officially as the top 600 taxpayers, and that means sort of property taxpayers per department. So, multiply that by what, about 90 departments. You're talking about a fairly small percentage of a population, but of course, these are the people who can possibly guide community opinion more broadly. So, they punch above their weight. They are notable for a reason. And yeah, I mean, I think had Louis XVIII's regime put a question mark behind a property settlement, then that Louis XVIII regime would have been in deep, deep trouble. But by and large, it doesn't, and of course, in effect, it won't. It respects that kind of land deal. And yeah, you might, I guess, I'm just trying to get into the mindset of one of these notables. You've got property. Some of that property is probably church land, which you've bought. You are possibly vaguely worried about the Comte d'Artois, the ultras coming along, sometime in the future. That probably weighs a little bit in your mind. But I think you are perhaps more or less confident that Louis XVIII isn't going to touch your kind of property. Napoleon, of course, is going to respect your property. You're fine there. Then I think it comes down partly to community dynamics. If the rest of your community absolutely loathes Napoleon, you can be pressurized. And in the South or somewhere, you might be, if you're obviously Bonapartist, you're probably well advised to leave for the time being and sort of move to perhaps you've got another property in Paris or something, and you just sort of get out and keep a very low profile. So to an extent, I guess the notables do reflect wider opinion in places which are heavily polarized. But a lot of France, I think, isn't heavily polarized. Bits are, either one way or the other. But a large part of France, I think, is in that wait and see mode. And there, personally, if I was one of these notables, I'd try not to commit myself too far either way. Do the bare minimum. And do it late. I mean, as Talleyrand, I think, once said, treason is basically getting your timing wrong. And the Bourbons, when they come back, I mean, they do actually make a distinction between those people that had, as it were, supported Napoleon before Louis XVIII exits French territory and after. After is okay. It's not brilliant, but it's kind of seen as a lower level, if you like, of disloyalty than beforehand. So my advice would be delay your vote.
Take your moment before siding with Napoleon. There you go. Helpful advice for anybody planning to open up their TARDIS and go back to 1815. Also, stay away from a little place called Waterloo on the 18th of June. Apparently, it gets very unhealthy. We have to talk about local elections. within all of this. I'm going to be completely honest. I know very little about anything to do with these local elections. So this question is from a position of ignorance. How significant are local issues within local elections, and how does that play into our understanding of what these reflect of Napoleon's return and popular sentiments to it? And I'm thinking here in sort of very modernistic terms of the way in which those who do well in local elections talk up the results, whereas those who do badly dismiss them as not being representative of a national mood. What is different, if anything, about that kind of notion in 1815 in France? And what do we see at play with these results?
So there's been a lot of discussion. Unsurprisingly, historians disagree over the interpretation of the local elections, just as they disagree on most other things when it comes to Napoleon. The historians' personal political inflection is then going to also have an impact on how they interpret the data in front of them. The data from the local elections, traditionally it's seen as, well, lots of the royalists keep the local mayors in post when they return, and therefore it suggests that the elections had been an anti-Napoleon gesture on the local level. I think there's enough evidence to say that actually many of those who were returned in 1815 had also already been in post before then, during the Napoleonic period, so that actually there's a greater level of continuity than might at first appear. So I think, as is often the way, I mean, we're in a properly pre-party politics environment where individuals, despite their leanings, are likely to be selected for who they are rather than which way they're going to jump in regime change. So I think that the general consensus, I'm not an expert on local elections either, but my sense of the general consensus is that it's not quite as royalist as some historians have made out when you look at the data for the returns on the local elections. The pattern is not that straightforward. So I think it probably is about local matters to local people in a world where it does take time for information to move from place to place, that there are very clear regional distinctions and local things happening because of just the distance to get to the nearest big town. I think that the local does matter more to people in an early modern society than perhaps the local matters in a global society where you can know exactly what's happening on the other side of the world, perhaps better than you can know who your neighbour is 10 doors down the street.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, these elections come about, of course, because Napoleon does something un-Napoleonic, i.e. something sort of democratic in 1815, and that is to open up mayoral positions to being elected. So under the Empire, pre-1814, of course, mayors of larger settlements, that means 5,000 plus of town cities, they're appointed by the emperor, and then mayors of smaller settlements, 5,000 or less, and that's the majority, of course, the vast majority, they're appointed by prefect. But then they say in 1815, okay, for the smaller ones, they can be elected, and that's how this comes about. I agree there with Kate. I mean, we're basically talking about the early modern period, the sort of tail end of that. And there often is only one obvious choice of person to sort of vote for. There might only be actually one sort of literate person in some of the very small communes, one person that can actually do the job. So it's not like modern local elections where you've got a sort of a list of people who all vaguely can do it, and you probably vote according to party preference anyway. So that is not how you have to envisage these. You're voting for somebody who is probably the only person that's ever done the job and ever will do the job, or their son. And hence you tend to get massive continuity across these regime changes. And I wouldn't even say it's necessarily the provision of modern services as such. I think we're in this sort of world partly of clientage and of who is kind of just important and who people sort of look up to in their community, including, who's going to kind of protect their interests and fight that community's corner with a prefect and, more ambitiously with the Minister of the Interior when it comes to the distribution of resources, or frankly being left alone by central government.
Okay, so that's the sort of inverted commas democratic picture, such as democracy exists during this period. It's not the only way, of course, that people can express an opinion. And there are risings against Napoleon in 1815. But this was one of the things that we didn't really get the chance to explore before. So I do want to take the time to look at it. Let's start with the Duchess of Angoulême, because she takes center stage here. Before we talk about what she's doing in terms of uprisings that she's helping to orchestrate, what's been her story? What's her background? What's she been doing with life pre the first abdication?
So Marie-Thérèse is the only surviving child by 1815 of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So she was with her parents in the Temple prison back in 1792, when the monarchy was suspended. During Napoleonic period, she'd lived in exile with the court of Louis XVIII, and then returned to France with him in 1814. So royalist propaganda very much styles her as Antigone, guiding her uncle Louis XVIII, and Napoleonic propagandists will sort of riff on that idea quite willingly. But that's very much, she's the sort of the Greek tragic heroine who's lost her parents to the guillotine, who's been forced into exile for all these years, returning to France with the First Restoration.
How does she manage to escape the guillotine?
The revolutionaries hoped, really, they had this slightly naive idea that the children could somehow be better educated to become, at least initially, the idea was that the children could be better educated to be less ancien regime than their parents. So that initially was why the children are sort of kept out of the court proceedings, and they're not put on trial in the way that Louis and Marie Antoinette are, because they don't actually hold a political position by the point at which the monarchy is suspended. So her brother, who was briefly Louis XVII, it was hope that if they could educate him in revolutionary ways, at least initially, the idea was that he could become the constitutional monarch, perhaps, that Louis XVI had proved incapable of being. I think they quite quickly realised that was never going to happen. But there was a sense that, at least for a while, the revolutionaries had greater hopes that education could offer a different model of kingship.
Mike, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I would stress how important the Duchesse d'Angoulême is. She is a kind of like a living martyr, she was imprisoned with her parents. She sees them guillotined. She sees her brother die. So, okay, Louis XVIII sees his brother die, but that's a slightly different level, if you like, of awfulness. So she is seen as a kind of martyr, and there's a kind of like a direct link, if you like. And maybe one almost thinks of sort of kind of the Christian mindset, which I think one needs to get into. She is the most proximate kind of living survivor to that sort of sacrilege, which is, I guess, as you would see it, especially against Louis the XVI, her father. There aren't any other kind of prominent female royals either. Louis XVIII's wife, who'd never been very prominent, I think has died by this point anyway. So the Duchesse d'Angoulême almost kind of functions as an ersatz queen in 1814 and throughout the reign of Louis XVIII. So she is incredibly important. She's overly prominent in royalist iconography, which treats her almost as a queen in being. And of course, she will become queen briefly, because of course she marries the Duc d'Artois, or the Comte d'Artois, i.e. Charles X's son. So she is the daughter of a queen who will herself become queen, and that's pretty much dynastically obvious by 1815. And what she's got going for her as well, of course, is that she will be a genuinely French queen. She won't be a Spanish Habsburg. She won't be an Austrian Habsburg. She won't be a Pole, i.e. like the Queen of Louis XV. She will be the first sort of French queen for a very long time. So in many ways, she presses some of the right buttons, the buttons which need to be pressed by Louis XVIII, who is not very charismatic. And if you are a sort of PR kind of expert, well, you've got your work cut out with you with Louis XVIII, but not with the Duchess, I don't think. You've got material to work with. And she's quite fierce and quite a formidable person, quite apart from her pedigree.
Yeah, Napoleon said she was the only man in the family.
Yes, a typical misogynist kind of Napoleon comment, which he also makes about the Queen of Prussia.
Yes, I mean Napoleon's consistent in that regard, if nothing else. Let's talk about how she actually ends up being in a position where she's orchestrating these, and then we'll go on to kind of think about significance of these uprisings. But how, bearing in mind this misogyny that is now embedded in French law, never mind being embedded in very old attitudes, how does she end up being integral to these uprisings, and what is she doing to help generate this motivation to rise up against Napoleon's return?
So we need to go to Bordeaux. Bordeaux as a royalist stronghold. What she is trying to do by going to Bordeaux, she's trying to hold the city for Louis XVIII as a springboard to coordinating a more sustained opposition to Napoleon, ideally with troops at her back and possibly English support that could come in through the port. It's only really when she realizes that some of the troops coming into the city are not going to back her, but they're actually more obviously pro-Bonapartist than she expected them to be, that she abandons the attempt to make Bordeaux a locus of opposition to Napoleon in military terms. It will remain a royalist space right the way through the 100 Days. If you look at the choice of plays that are put on at the theatres in the city, they're very clearly putting on plays that can be interpreted as royalist rather than pro-Bonapartist. So I think it's very clear that Bordeaux remains royalist regardless. But what the Duchess of Angoulême can't do is make it the basis for a military push against Napoleon. So at that point, she concedes defeat. She doesn't want pointless bloodshed when it's clear that the army is largely is on Napoleon's side rather than on Louis XVIII's. So she will then go to Ghent and join Louis in exile there.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem. It's the military units in Bordeaux, and there's this sort of scene where she appears in front of them and gauges their opinion, and it becomes quite clear that it is hostile. I think that hostility is even expressed sort of verbally or audibly. But then she kind of stands her ground somewhat until there's silence, and then she sort of backs out. So she kind of behaves with a degree of bravery and dignity, I think, which does a degree of credit. But of course, that isn't quite good enough if you want to win over the French army. And I think, yeah, I mean, again, to her credit and to others on the royalist side, I think there is a fear of civil war. And that is perhaps the worst possible outcome. And of course, you don't really get that in France in 1815, with, of course, the major footnote of the White Terror, which comes in the aftermath of Waterloo, in which perhaps 200 or 300 die. But you haven't got a civil war in the sort of 1790s sense, where tens, if not hundreds of thousands die.
Yeah, I mean, this is often said to be one of Ney's motivations, isn't it, for
Mm.
having made these grandiose claims about bringing Napoleon back in an iron cage, thereby, of course, pretty much signing his own death warrant
Mm.
should things go up in smoke, but when he then switches sides. And it's important to retain that sort of awareness of what has happened in France's recent history and how that is playing on people's minds. Staying with key women in the 1815 story, I want to talk about Marie Louise. Napoleon desperately wanted her, or at the very least his son, the King of Rome, to return to his side. Before we talk about the implications of the fact that that doesn't materialize, what's she been up to post abdication?
So Marie-Louise is an interesting figure because traditionally she's seen as, she's young, she doesn't have any agency, she's just buffeted around by the Allies. I think that opinion is turning slightly. But so she'd initially wanted to join Napoleon at Fontainebleau in 1814, but had been persuaded to seek out her father, the Austrian Emperor, first. And then because Napoleon isn't really issuing clear instructions,
Mm.
she agrees to go to Austria with a view to rejoining Napoleon at some point, but there's a sense that she finds it easier to become the loyal daughter again than the awkward daughter who wants to go to Elba with Napoleon. There was talk of sending her to Parma, which would mean she'd have been within easy reach of Elba, but in the end, she and the King of Rome will stay in Austria. So in 1814, there was an opportunity, and it appears that she was keen to go with Napoleon into exile, but she's talked out of that. It doesn't seem as though she perhaps puts up a huge amount of effort into resisting being talked out of it. And obviously, there's all sorts of rumours about how she was encouraged to fall in love with someone else so that she would miss Napoleon less, and therefore there's a lot of talk about manipulating her and what she was doing. In the end, she does stay in Austria, whatever the motivations or whatever manipulation goes on behind the scenes. She doesn't go and join him in Elba. And when he returns in 1815, I think her decision to stay in Austria is based on what's best for her son. If Napoleon loses, she has a chance of becoming regent. If Napoleon wins, she can claim that her father prevented her from joining her husband. So she's sort of able to hedge her bets a little bit in 1815 by staying where she is, rather than making a very clear political statement at that point to go back to Paris. But Napoleon is most definitely hurt by her not returning to Paris. I don't think he
This
was
is
expecting that.
this is one of the interesting things for me that we talk a lot about Napoleon and what he's risking in 1815 and how dangerous this is for him. But actually, there's scope for this to be a really dangerous moment for her as well. Because if she makes a wrong move and becomes implicated rather in everything that's going on in France, she herself could find herself on the wrong side of history. And I'm really not in a position to speculate about, the position of danger that she might have found herself in. But how I wonder if we can just sort of dig a little bit more into kind of the way in which she's trying to navigate this. Do we know much about her personal reactions to this? Whether she's sort of sending letters to her father, kind of saying, well, seeking advice. Do we have any kind of indication of any of that?
I don't know that I've read very much of the correspondence. There is certainly correspondence happening, and we know that she writes to Napoleon. She's asking for guidance from him. She's what, in her early 20s? She's still very young, um, and so is looking for guidance from Napoleon. Her ladies in waiting are not keen on going to Elba. That's the story that's put out. The ladies in waiting convince her that she shouldn't go because it's a backwater in the middle of nowhere. She'd be much better off back in Austria. So it's quite difficult to unpick, I think, the extent to which she's making decisions, the extent to which decisions are being made for her. I don't think the absence of clear guidance from Napoleon at this point helps in 1814. In 1815, it's very different. He is definitely writing and asking her to return. By that point, he's making it very clear But I think the moment has passed at that point. I think the moment has moved on. She's had 12 months to think about what her best, not necessarily what her best option is, but the best option for her son. And even after Waterloo, of course, Napoleon is still hoping that his son will succeed him. And therefore, it makes perfect sense for Marie-Louise to be trying to protect her son's interests above those of her husband right the way through this period of February to June 1815.
And Mike, let me get your thoughts on all of this.
I mean, Marie-Louise has a great aunt, Maria Carolina, who's of course the queen of the two Sicilies. So the not the Murat kingdom, but the actual real thing. Yeah, I mean, she's Maria Carolina is actually she'll be the sister of Marie Antoinette. And she sort of tells Marie-Louise in 1814 that no one would have kept her apart from her husband, even if it meant climbing out the window by tying the bed sheets together. And this is despite the fact that she hates Napoleon, you know. So the great aunt, I think, would have said did say to Marie-Louise, you follow your husband, come what may. It's an outrage that you're being kept apart, you know, by these sort of great powers. I don't know. I don't entirely agree here with Kate in that I don't think she has that much agency. I don't quite see what she could do. And I'm not sure if they're entirely unfounded rumors about this lover, i.e. Count Neipperg, who seems to be a notorious womanizer, or somebody who's very, you know, who's very kind of adept at at seducing people, and who seems to have been put in touch with Marie-Louise by Metternich, who tends to be quite good at this type of politicking. And Count Neipperg actually sort of boasts that he'll sort of like seduce her within a year or so, and he does it much quicker than that. So I think I agree with Kate in a sense that Marie-Louise has moved on in her own mind, you know, to a life after Napoleon. And I think from her perspective, Napoleon's return from Elba in early 1815 is really unwelcome. It's not something she's happy about, really. It sort of complicates her future. Yes, I mean, I guess to an extent she's concerned about her son, the King of Rome, of course, as he's known. But when he grows up, I think there's a degree of resentment by him of her, of Marie-Louise, that she perhaps didn't behave towards Napoleon as she might have done. And, you know, she'll go on to marry Count Neipperg, who, you know, is an accomplished general in 1815. He helps defeat Murat. Yeah, Marie-Louise is in a tricky position at one level, but less tricky in the sense that I think she's got less agency. And if she, you know, she's the Congress of Vienna, she's basically nowhere to be seen. You know, at one level, she's a bit of an embarrassment for the Habsburgs and to European politics generally. But I think as long as she sort of stays in Parma, doesn't try and go to France or anything like that, or go anywhere near France, she's perfectly safe, you know. Nothing is going to happen to her.
Just thinking about this from a wider European and perhaps a situation within French politics as well, what kind of a message does this send? You know, Napoleon's wife hasn't returned to his side. Do you get people whispering about, you know, people deserting sinking ships? Because she hadn't been solely a figurehead, as I understand it, pre-abdication. She had some constitutional responsibilities and duties. You know, was there a sense also, I mean, there's talk about some kind of regency under Marie-Louise amongst the Bonapartists. They're not initially talking perhaps about Napoleon returning, but rather some other form of Bonapartist regime. Is this seen as a chink in Napoleon's armor when he's sort of desperately looking for legitimacy and is trying to sort of sell this story about, look, I'm back and I'm popular and everybody loves me, and yet his wife seemingly doesn't? Is this a problem for him?
I think it is a problem for him. It's a big blow to his case for legitimacy that his own wife isn't coming back to support his return to power. Hortense, who is both his stepdaughter and sister-in-law, has to take on that role instead. Now she does it very well, and she remains loyal to him throughout. Much, there's a really stark contrast there between the loyalty that Josephine's daughter shows him, and given how he's treated Josephine with the divorce and everything, you'd think that she was one of the less likely people to be loyal absolutely to the end. So you've got quite a contrast between Hortense being uber loyal, representing him officially, being the society hostess, doing all of the sorts of things that actually Marie-Louise should have been doing. There is a contrast there, and I think it does affect Napoleon in terms of morale. But more broadly, I think it sends quite a very awkward signal that his grasp of the case for legitimacy is not quite as strong as it might have been.
Yeah, I mean, constitutionally, Marie-Louise does become a little bit more important after the Mallet conspiracy of 1812. So this is this conspiracy led by a general who some saw as a bit of a lunatic, who's got Republican sympathies, and he tries to overthrow Napoleon during the Russian campaign while Napoleon is away from Paris. And some people buy into this conspiracy. They buy into the idea that Napoleon has died. And so it's a bit like a Stauffenberg plot, where you hope, I guess, as a conspirator, that when enough people have signed up, even when the news comes out that actually Napoleon isn't dead, that they're so committed that they're going to go ahead with it anyway. But what kind of comes out of that conspiracy, amongst other things, is that no one really bothers to think of a king of Rome as a successor. If the emperor's dead, long live the emperor. It should have gone to Napoleon II. But everyone starts politicking and sort of thinking, what's going to happen? And it isn't obvious. So on the back of that, Napoleon amends the constitution, and they create this kind of additional element to the constitution, which allows for a regency. So Marie-Louise, all of a sudden, in constitutional law terms, becomes more important after 1812, in that if the emperor is incapacitated, she automatically becomes Empress Regent, with fairly substantial powers, things like ministerial appointment and so on. She can't amend the constitution, but she's got some fairly big powers, which is unusual in this sort of patriarchal Napoleonic system. But, what use is that in 1815? She's not there. She's, I think, in her own mind, moved on. She's in territory controlled by the Austrians, i.e., by her father, who in a way she does look for guidance. I agree with Kate that that leaves a deficit, a hole on the Napoleonic side, and that monarchy in this period needs a strong queen or empress, a consort. And Louis XVIII has got that in the Duchesse d'Angoulême. And yeah, I mean, I'm amazed at Hortense. Not only has she been mother been treated, I guess, shabbily, but Napoleon has basically forced her into a marriage with an awful husband, Louis. And she'd have every reason to sort of kind of be resentful. So rather like her brother, I'm always amazed at the kind of loyalty of the Beauharnais towards the Beauharnais children towards their stepfather.
Now, we're talking a lot about legitimacy here. On the other side of all of this is what I would personally describe as the legitimate government of France. Cue a huge ding dong with those who regard Napoleon as the legitimate ruler. How do you determine legitimacy during this period? A whole series of questions there. What are your thoughts, I guess, first of all, on that issue? The idea that Louis XVIII is the legitimate ruler of France. Is this something that we could have a big argument about, or are you quite sort of content with that notion? Mike, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you treat this at two levels, legally and in a kind of historically, I think, more significant sense of what is Louis XVIII and what a Napoleon perceived as, and then by whom, by French opinion or by European opinion. And by French opinion, I think Louis XVIII has that huge problem of having been out of France and having returned in a baggage train of the Allies. So he is not national at one level. He can be deemed as being anti-national, which is again is why I think they plug this Duchesse d'Angoulême kind of thing. You need that kind of direct link to Louis the 16th, and she provides that in certain ways more than Louis the 18th does. So she's a real asset there. Yeah, I mean, Napoleon has been welcomed back by the army, which I guess in many periods of modern French history has portrayed itself as the essence of France. You know, as recently as the late 1950s and early 1960s. There's that kind of thread running through. When it comes to internationally, one might sort of conclude, Louis the 18th is obviously the legitimate one, and everyone is against Napoleon. And I think that's largely true, but I think there are worries on the Allied side that are we, the Allies, going to be trying to impose forevermore some kind of ruler on France who won't be accepted by the French? And I know when it comes to British liberal opinion, there's a real resistance against the notion that one country can impose a ruler upon another country. So there's that argument making the rounds, and it's a real problem. So maybe if I stuck my head out, I would say that actually neither of them are convincing legitimate, which is going to kind of set up France for about 3 generations of problem until you essentially come up with a system based upon Republican government, where in a way you haven't got legitimacy focused on one person or one family.
I mean, this is a really interesting point in itself, isn't it? That you could build a very convincing case very easily that he's not necessarily the favorite individual in the Allied camp at this point in time, because he's just lost the throne that they'd given him, handed it to him on a platter by virtue of the blood of their armies, and yet he's not put up a particularly decent fight of trying to hold on to this throne. Kate, what do you make of it all?
So, because it's not the BBC, I can plug a book, can't I?
You can plug a book anywhere. Well, actually, I don't know if you can plug a book on the
So
BBC.
I've got an edited volume that I did with Mark Philp to mark the bicentenary of Waterloo, which is called Napoleon's 100 Days and the Politics of Legitimacy. So it's a Palgrave, it's a Palgrave Macmillan volume. So I'll recommend that for anybody who wants to spend a really long time exploring legitimacy.
We'll put a link in the episode description, folks.
Excellent, thank you very much. What I think is really at the heart of this is that we're on the cusp between an early modern world and a modern world here, where legitimacy can be bestowed by the people rather than God. So the Bourbon, the traditional French monarchy, is a rule bestowed by God. And Napoleon represents legitimacy bestowed by the people or the nation. And so the two worlds are vying at this point in 1815 to see which version of legitimacy we actually might be going for. In the end, yes, neither of them will win out. The march of democracy, if you want to see that as a sort of a notion of progress, is going to be the thing that comes through eventually in France. But we're at that really interesting point at this moment, where, as Mike has been saying, that idea that the British could start interfering when the French have welcomed Napoleon back. What right do the Allies have to actually say, actually, we don't like the person you've selected to lead the country. We're going to impose our own choice. We are really on the cusp of the modern there. And obviously, it's the whole question of what rights allies have to interfere in a nation being taken over, whether we call it coup d'etat or not, is one that still has political legs today. It's not an issue that's gone away. So we're at a point that we're tipping the balance towards the people having more weight, and that idea of God declaring or vetting or verifying, providing legitimacy for the monarch is on the wane.
Does the fact that the Allies sort of turn around and scream, Napoleon's not legitimate, we're declaring him an outlaw, Mike, you were making the point that that therefore means he can just be shot at the side of the road by anybody, and they're not liable for punishment. Does that actually bolster Napoleon's case? Does it have sort of the inverse impact in that it sort of galvanizes the French people into sort of going, well, who are these people coming in, invading, destroying our armies, killing our people? We decided on Napoleon as a ruler, and he's come back, and they're still not prepared to accept him. Does that kind of help to harden French attitudes? It's certainly a line that Napoleon can use as political spin, but does it convince people?
Yes, I think it does. I think in two senses. At one level, it almost makes him embody France in almost kind of a literal sense, and that he's taking upon himself the kind of direct threat that France is going to experience. And I think secondly, it boosts Napoleon's status, because by doing that, and this actually comes apparent in some of the legal arguments which happen after Napoleon's defeat, and what to do with him, and should he be, what should happen to him after Waterloo. I mean, is he being treated here as an individual, as a rebel, or in effect as some kind of sovereign entity? He's almost being given some kind of suprahuman accreditation by the way that the Allies handle him. I think they need to do that. They need to kind of somehow separate him out from France. I mean, he's quite clearly not an ordinary kind of bandit. That's just not credible. And if he was, then it's actually not for the Allies to declare him an outlaw, but for the French government to deal with it. So he's not then an international problem. He's simply a national problem. So they have to kind of almost elevate him in order to deal with him. But by elevating him at one level, they're kind of making the problem slightly worse.
Got it in a nutshell. I have nothing to add to that. That's absolutely that's a problem of the Allies' own making, in effect, because they do bolster his legitimacy by. It's ironic, isn't it? They bolster his legitimacy by declaring him an outlaw. It makes it very easy then for him to portray himself as victim, and to legitimize the move to go to war that the French may have been a little bit reluctant to endorse, having had so many years of warfare. It makes it very much easier for Napoleon to then say, we have to go to war now, that we have no choice, they're not going to leave us alone.
There is a theme running through this, and it has actually run through other interviews that I've done on sort of the 1815 crisis, particularly Evan Wilson kind of turning around and making the point. This is, in many respects, a crisis of the Allies' own making. It doesn't need to happen. We're not going to deep dive into the battle itself. We spent actually too much time talking about it at the BBC, to the point where they had to cut a huge chunk of material. So if you want that, folks, then go and listen to the original. What I do want to indulge in very briefly is just a little bit of fun counterfactual. What if Napoleon wins? My stance on this has always been very clear. There's a Waterloo by another name coming at some point anyway, because the Austrians and the Russians will come marching over the hill. The counter argument, of course, being, well, can Napoleon spread discord and buy himself time and rearm and bolster support in France? Yes, victory at Waterloo would unquestionably have helped to have solidified his position back in France. But do I think the Russians and the Austrians are suddenly going to sue for peace? No. Do I think the British are going to sue for peace? Actually, no, because they haven't done at any other point, and they've been sent packing by Napoleon on a few occasions before. So I don't see the coalition falling apart, but that's me and my opinion. What's your take on this? Kate, do you want to start us off?
I think I agree with you, to be honest, Zach. I think that even if Napoleon had won the battle at Waterloo, in the end, it wouldn't have made any difference. It might have been a matter of months. It might have been maybe a year. The Allies, having declared him an outlaw, having very much staked their claim to supporting Louis XVIII and restoring the monarchy, are not going to. The battle would not have been decisive. Even if he'd have won Waterloo, it would not have been an absolute drubbing. And therefore, the Allies would have felt that actually they'd have a good chance to have another go and that the result might be different. So I think it would have been a different battlefield, potentially on a different day, possibly a different month. Might have even had to have waited a full campaign year till the following spring, but at some point they would have ended up defeating the French forces. Having made that decision to declare him an outlaw and insist that the security of the monarchies of Europe require his removal, they're going to keep going until they get the result that they want. Even if they didn't, even if they'd said, oh, you know what, you played that really well, you know what, we'll go home. Napoleon might have eked out a few more years. Yeah, he's dead by 1821. He'd still have been dead by 1821, if not earlier, had he remained in power. And therefore, in all likelihood, there would have been a return to the monarchy at that point, rather than a continuity of the empire under the King of Rome. So I think even if the Allies had said, okay, we don't fancy this any longer, I still think we would have ended up with a restoration of the monarchy.
Interesting. So you don't think the regime could have survived beyond Napoleon's demise?
No.
Mike?
I think there are too many cracks already by 1813, 1814. There are so many cracks that Napoleon is struggling to paper over them. I haven't seen anything about the King of Rome that or Marie-Louise as regent, that convinces me that the pair of them could have held that together, even with the support of people like Fouché, assuming that Fouché stayed on board and didn't make his own power grab.
Yeah, it's difficult to kind of envisage play out a war game or a game out a scenario. I mean, I suppose, the worst that could have happened to the Allies is that not only are they defeated, but that something like an Aurum Moyena happens to them, and it would have perhaps happened on the 16th, so a couple of days before. So the armies, essentially the Allied armies, are somehow surrounded and capitulate. They're utterly destroyed, both of them, in sequence. That would be the best outcome for Napoleon. So they're not going to be back in the game then for a whole year. But you have got the Austrians and the Russians marching in. Would they have halted at that point? Would France have been energized sufficiently to push things into an extra year, 1816? And then I think you're into, if the Allies stick with it and the Prussians and the British rebuild, then you're back to essentially 1813, 14. I think then the salvation for Napoleon comes politically, and it's in the coalition somehow fracturing. And I don't think the British are going to fracture unless somehow domestic opinion starts to become overwhelmingly negative. John Boyle being overburdened with taxes, that kind of thing. And we don't want to impose some kind of regime on France against their will. It just isn't doable. And then voices start to kind of be raised about an alternative. And then the Allies start to fall out about what that alternative might be. Is it going to be Bernadotte or Marie-Louise or something like that? And I mean, I think Prussian and Austrian and to an extent British, if you detach public opinion, policy tends to be fairly consistent. But I was interested in the vagaries of Russian politics and how a lot depends on the Tsar. And of course, you had those episodes early on in the Napoleonic Wars with Catherine dying and then Paul coming along and switching, and then Alexander. If Alexander the First suddenly has some kind of new Pauline kind of conversion moment, he's already had one before, and suddenly says, okay, I want Bernadotte, or I can't stand the Bourbons. He doesn't really like Louis XVIII very much anyway. And the Allies start to kind of fall apart. Or the Prussians demand more. And I think the Allies are very clever in not really amending the First Treaty of Paris in their own minds. And because that might have opened up a real Pandora's box, which would have led to disunity. But I think you're talking about a sort of 1% chance of any of that happening at best, of such a colossal defeat of Allied arms is very hard to war game out. And combined with such a colossal failure of coalition politics, I mean, it's almost like kind of the odds of winning the lottery, the jackpot, as it were.
The odds of Bernadotte becoming the King of France. Now, there's a whole counterfactual rabbit hole that we will not dive into. What we will talk about is Waterloo enduring, and it sort of spreads almost like a historical rash across the landscape of Britain, the Empire, the wider world. You've got Waterloos across the United States, for example. But one particularly enduring form for discussion of the battle became historical literature. And I have an often repeated, very well rehearsed rant about how I've spent half of my career, quite frankly, playing historical whack-a-mole with regards to Waterloo myths that have come courtesy of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Um, what does the fact that Waterloo continues to be a reference point in literature tell us about the status of the battle in popular memory?
So the Battle of Waterloo as a sort of a focus or a starting point for fiction becomes really quite a significant leitmotif in French literature of the 19th century. It does for other literatures as well. I mean, we talk about the influence of Napoleon and Waterloo on Byron, for instance. But in the French context, Waterloo and the return to power of Napoleon serve as reference points because they encompass a romantic sense of grandeur and excitement and unity that is too tempting for writers to resist. So it's not just Victor Hugo with Les Miserables. We've got Stendhal with the Charterhouse of Parma, where the sort of the Napoleonic, the temptation of the Napoleonic legend is something that Stendhal can't quite escape. You've got Alexandre Dumas, obviously his ancestry in very much in the Napoleonic battles. The Count of Monte Cristo is absolutely archetypally set against the 100 Days. So it becomes a way for writers to think about romantic with a capital R, as in the sort of the literary movement of Romanticism being about uniting with something greater than the whole and joining the yin and the yang and finding ways of seeing greatness. And I think that it becomes just a very easy way for writers to start putting a layer into their fiction by having Waterloo and the 100 Days there as a cultural reference point that everybody is going to understand.
We can't talk about the 100 Days and not discuss the Vienna settlement. There's so many questions we could ask here. I guess the first and most obvious one is, how much does France suffer as a result of Napoleon's return? These are the guys who are left picking up the pieces, right? What is the impact for France? Army of occupation being an obvious starting point there, but thinking kind of more broadly in terms of how the Vienna settlement looks different in late 1815 compared to what we see being discussed in the first part of 1815. Mike, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are important repercussions for France, not really when it comes to territory. Yeah, I mean, you need a fairly detailed map to sort of spot the difference. They lose some territory. There's some humiliations, return of looted artworks. So I guess the Louvre would be much fuller than it is today, but for the 100 Days. France is occupied, large army of occupation, 150,000 troops, all the way up to 1818, and they have a reparations payment thing imposed upon them. I mean, I think you could twist the reparations and sort of say that it does them good in that they need to sort of take out loans and operate in the international money markets, which you can only really do having a constitutional, semi-sane government, which the ultras are not going to be. So I think in a curious way that might actually help embed constitutional monarchy and probity into the French system a little bit more. Not that it's seen that way at the time by French public opinion, which of course resents this foreign troop presence. I think it's catastrophic in terms of sort of sectarianism in the South, and you have that sort of white terror. You have 200 to 300 people being sort of killed, lynched, Bonapartists, people who are seen as enemies of the monarchy. by lynch mobs who often are dressed up as National Guardsmen and are given a degree of license, I guess, by royalist inclined local authorities before that's put a stop to. Mind you, I think that's the last wave of, and this is partly religious violence. I mean, it's not ostensibly framed in those terms, but it is in reality, I think, a bit of a holdover of some of the religious violence you'd had in the late 1600s and early 1700s in the South. I mean, it's not going to happen again after 1815, mind you. So I think a mixed bag for France, and I say in a curious way, the constitutional government, I think, is more likely to succeed thanks to the reparations and that need to deal with the Allies. So I buy into some of this new literature on that occupation, which sees it as, in many ways, a kind of model occupation in certain respects.
One of the curious things about the terms of the Vienna settlement is trying to tread the line between punishing France for Napoleon's return to power, but not punishing Louis XVIII as returning ruler of France. So there's some interesting dynamics there. Talleyrand tries very hard to argue that you can't punish Louis XVIII for what Napoleon is doing. He is partially successful in that line of argument, but there is a sense that the Allies are trying to juggle. They have to show that they have to show their displeasure at Napoleon's return to power, and that France has to be punished for that. But they can't strip, apart from the artworks. Obviously, they strip plenty of the artworks back out of the country, but they can't bleed the country dry because they're trying to put Louis XVIII back in, and they want his regime to succeed. So there is a balancing of trying to make sure that they don't take so much that Louis XVIII then can't make a good stab at the second restoration. Louis has to respond to Napoleon's return to power. The ease with which Napoleon was able to persuade the army to back him, the ease with which he returns to power, does give Louis pause for thought. I think then does shape, to a certain extent, the remainder of his reign. I think Charles X is a different matter. He becomes increasingly reactionary and increasingly ultra because he hasn't had to deal very directly with the consequences of Napoleon showing how fragile Louis XVIII's reign actually is at that point. So I think it does have implications for the way in which the Second Restoration plays out, and the influence of Napoleon's return to power on Louis XVIII, perhaps a more significant than perhaps anything that the Allies impose on France as a result of Waterloo.
Napoleon echoes on well beyond the battlefields of Waterloo and the lyrics of ABBA. Kate Astbury, Professor in French Studies at the University of Warwick, and Michael Rowe, Reader in European History, King's College London. Thank you so much for joining me. Folks, please show your appreciation for these two lovely scholars who not only spent a good hour and a half discussing all of this at the BBC, but have now given you an additional 2 hours worth of listening and thought-provoking commentary on Napoleon's 100 Days. If you'd like to hear the original episode, BBC's In Our Time, Napoleon's 100 Days is available wherever you get your podcasts. Kate, Michael, thank you so much for joining me.
A pleasure.
Thanks very much, Zach.
Folks, do me a favor. Make sure you are following the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Hit that subscribe button so that you can find your way back. And if you're loving the show, please leave a review. Remember, we're in the midst of trying to rebuild after Spotify unplugged us from at least a third of our listener base. So these are all the most powerful things that you can do to help with that recovery. If you want to go that little bit further, remember that there is a Patreon feed. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod, where you can find a host of perks from early releases to exclusive content, behind the scenes footage, exclusive meetups, and much more besides. Shout outs to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Lucy Tatner, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Coulson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Mark Trowbridge, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, Martin Pisani, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, David Graylick, Ted Andrews, David Malinsky, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Jason Mohan, Mark Chestnut, and Giovanni. And the Admirals, John Haynes, Ryan Diamond, JC Kaiser, Bob Burnham, Mike Guest, Liam Telfer, Todd and Led Campbell, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Maxwell, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Dan Hazelwood, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, and Tim Day. I'll be back very soon, but until then, I'm Zach White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.